All right, so let's talk about kind of the second half of this discussion. Okay, so the first half of this discussion is the update is that we're going to court. All right, second half of this discussion.
Yeah.
If the ruling goes through that we can no longer operate how we have been operating, then what does that mean for the market as a whole and for buyers, et cetera? Okay, so Tom Oliver has a good point. Tom says, wouldn't this lead to a huge adjustment? If the entire market goes to the buyers paying their agents, many of them are already asking for money back from the sellers for closing to help. Something is going to have to give.
Right.
So, yes, essentially, what they're requesting is that the buyer agent compensation be covered in the buyer's representation agreement, and that is paid for by the buyer.
I don't think they know they're negotiating for that, though, do they?
So I think what they're trying to do is say, well, buyer's agents should make less money, so let's put it on the buyer so they know exactly what they're paying the buyer agent, right. And thus it would decrease the amount that most buyers agents gain because most will be afraid to charge or can't charge what they previously could charge. I think that's the argument, but what it will lead to is professional agents saying, hey, this is my fee. And then the buyer has to pay that as part of it. So a lot of people that have to request, like Tom is saying, they need help with closing costs. Maybe they're even getting 100% down loan. Well, now they're faced with a difficult decision. Should I pay for representation and try to walk through this with someone who knows exactly what they're doing? Or because I can't afford a house and an agent, should I just use a listing agent who's going to keep both sides of that commission and also work primarily for the seller?
Even though they're not supposed to, they have a fiduciary agreement in place with that seller.
Correct. I think
they're not going to protect you. They're going to protect the seller.
It negatively impacts someone who is maybe not financially well off. So I don't see this going very far. But if it does pass, that's basically how it's going to happen. Now, in Arkansas, we charge the buyer. We have an agreement that says, here's our commission rate. But then in that agreement, it says that they give us permission to accept partial or complete payment of that compensation from the listing or from the seller. Right. And it's stated very plainly in that agreement.
Right.
Lisa Perks said, remember the days before buyer's agents even existed? Caveat emptor. Buyer beware.
Yeah, I mean, so
Vince says terms between a buyer and seller can be anything. The offer can contain a buyer agent buyer rep compensation. I have seen those offers that include a buyer rep compensation in it, but technically a buyer
renegotiation
and a seller is not. An agent and the listing agent and buying agent, they're not a party to the purchase of a home. So in my opinion, it shouldn't be included. But yes, just like we do with lender closing costs, you could include it in the purchase of a home. So
right, but I can't renegotiate a listing contract that Ray got signed. That's right. What that offer is essentially. If I say you're offering me 2%, I want 3%. Your seller could agree to that. It would supersede, but I can't renegotiate that contract that's already been agreed to. It's not, so yeah, there's obviously ways to get around it, but we do have the same, that BRE has the same thing in there where it says, it specifically states, the other good thing about it, Ray mentioned buyer agency, it lays out what our job duties are.
All right. So Vince says, I guess I'm the only one who doesn't care about the lawsuit result. I think it's an important result one way or the other. I tend to believe that the way most of our industry is handling the discussion about commissions with a buyer is disingenuous. Most of the time, a real estate agent says, we're free to use for you. And that's not necessarily true. If you're completely free, then there would be no compensation given to you. Right. So that's not an effective way to have that conversation. So I think the lawsuit is an important one to have a good discussion about the correct paperwork and how things should be managed. But I don't know that it's going to change the structure It seems like it's going to change the paperwork. I think that's the reality.
Well, and a good outcome of it. Yes, Tim, you always do miss it. We were talking heavily about you, but we love you ultimately. But a good outcome of it would force buyers agents that kind of half-ass it, and they get a lead and they throw it against the wall to see if it sticks, and see if they can get something into escrow, and if they don't, they just kind of move on. It'll really force buyers agents to step up their game and really prove why they're worth what a listing agent makes. If it's 3% on both sides, they're going to have to prove why they make that money. And I welcome that challenge. I really do.
It also gives an avenue for big companies like Open Door and some of these other companies to show that we're not collecting the buyer agent compensation and stuff like that, that we're collecting a discounted compensation, in which previously they'll say that we're not going to charge you as much. But on the other hand, if they don't charge them, then the listing agent just keeps it all. So it doesn't really make a difference in the price of the house or anything.
No, and especially right now.
Ooh, that's a great point. Zachary Norwood said, would hurt VA loan buyers since it prohibits buyer agency fees.
Right.
That's a very good point, Zachary. And
and it would
brought up in court, because now you're hurting the military buyers.
Oh, you don't want to hurt military buyers.
Michael Elizabeth Royal said, buyers agents already have a bad rap as lesser agents.
Yes.
I don't know.
No, they do.
You think they do?
Absolutely.
You work a lot with buyers. I don't think so. In the industry, I see it as really difficult work. Vince says, buyers pay for the rep, sellers pay for their rep. Let negotiating allow the result.
So that's the thing, though, is
that's in theory, but that's not, like, for this instance, for a military purchaser who they can't buy a house if they're having to come out with $3,000 to $6,000 to $9,000 extra dollars when they barely have the down payment, or they're getting 100% VA loan, but they can't cover their closing costs. They're asking the seller to cover their closing cost, and now you're putting an additional charge on them.
So. Yeah, for any buyers, especially in the markets like we're dealing with today, where we have an article coming up, things are going for 20, 30, 50 grand over asking.
Yeah,
you're already increasing your down payment. So if you're FHA and you have 3.5% to put down, where are you going to get the other 2 or 3%? And it's in theory, it's coming from the equity in the sale of the home, and that's just how it works.
VA could change their protocol, as Vince mentions. They could, but I'm never. It's going to be slow happening. So let's say it does go through. We may see a decrease in home purchase price across the board, unless there's a way for buyers to still get compensation from the seller or the listing broker. There would likely be a decrease from about 2 to 3% across the nation in purchase price, which increases the affordability, but over a 30-year loan, not upfront cash.
Right.
And that, I think, is the rub. Lisa Perk said, and buyer's agents has to accept the fee as stated. Veteran cannot pay anything toward agent compensation. The government will spring into action on that, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think that was heavily laced in sarcasm.
Yeah. All right, so let's move on to the next article, Dan.
Well, to sum up, we're both kind of on the same page, which we're always on opposite page. We hate each other, if you guys don't know us in real life, but we welcome the conversation. I think it'll open up a good conversation, but it probably won't go anywhere too far.
Yeah, probably the lawsuit itself probably won't go anywhere, but